Dan Cherny, welcome to Perceived Pressure.
Daany, good to be with you.
Um, the listeners will, I mean, they wouldn't know with the magic of audio, but I'm going to tell them because we're up front that I forgot to hit record the first time on this, and I let you go into a bit of a flow state on the summer so far. But I guess do you feel like you got your money's worth? And I guess there's this other sort of element that I'm interested in of there was a clip of you on the Code Sports Instagram sort of throughout, Ash's diaries, if you will. And there was a clip of you, I think it might have been after Brisbane or possibly Adelaide, where like you appeared like genuinely very angry with sort of just the manner of English dismissals, and like not to turn this into two Aussies ragging on England, but it was put to me in Sydney by another member of the press pack that they felt disrespected by England playing the way that they did, and players like fundamentally like being shit at the thing that they're supposed to be committed to being good at. Is that a feeling that sort of am I right in reading you as angry in at parts?
Angry might be a tiny bit of a stretch. I think I was probably just gobsmacked, and I disrespected. There's no personal affront. Probably the one personal affront was Melbourne only lasting 2 days, because as a proud Melbourneian Victorian, I felt shortchanged by a 2 day Boxing Day test. I mean, there's also an element. I think where it becomes a bit personal, leaving the Melbourne thing to one side, is as a journalist, you put in a lot of time into building up these series, and then it's sort of all over so quickly. And particularly when England was so limp, and there was so much hype around it, that you just do want some sort of enduring contest, or at the very least, just to have some variety in what you're writing about. And not that there wasn't any variety. There was a lot of, there were the occasional nip tuck within games, probably not nearly enough. There were some outstanding individual performances, and often the car crash, as you would well know, is a better story than if things are smooth sailing. But I think it was more just sort of looking back at England and just being sort of bemused by how stupid they could be. I mean, it's just that every because they were so. I think the thing was, it was just they had such a good chance. Australia, there were so many things going against Australia from an injury perspective, particularly, and then from a team instability perspective as an extension of that. Plenty of issues with the batting. I mean, got to the end of the Sydney Test, and there were probably only three, maybe four members of the top seven that had really entrenched their positions, being Steve Smith, who obviously is a lock, Travis Head, who hadn't started the series, where he ended up finishing it. And Alex Carey had a very good series too, and then Bo Webster coming in as a cameo. But obviously Khawaja finished up, and then questions over Labuschagne, Green, and Weatherald. So I think and then when you consider all the injuries for an Australian perspective, and England were in the games, they were in all tests at various points. I mean, they were red hot in Perth. They were ahead of the game in Perth. They should have won Perth, definitely. Obviously, they won Melbourne in the end, which was described, variously as a crapshoot, which I don't think is an unfair description. But Brisbane threw it away, both with the bat, some terrible bowling, and then particularly in the field. Adelaide, probably always playing a bit of catch up in Adelaide, albeit had probably restricted Australia. Australia didn't bat particularly well on day one, and sort of got away with it. And then in Sydney, a little bit the same, just not taking the most of their opportunities, had sort of a foothold in the game at various points and just let it slip. So I think as an overall package, it left with a sense of the unfulfilled and what might have been, because I think we've seen so many compelling Ashes series in England, and it's now been so long since we've had a truly close Ashes, engrossing Ashes series. they've been engrossing Ashes series in Australia for other reasons, and they end up generally being, will Australia win 5-0? And after a while, even that narrative wears off a bit. So, yeah, that was probably the prevailing thoughts.
I guess what interests me is that, and Ashes series do this, right? Like you say, we hype these things up so much, and we turn them into big picture sort of microcosms of the state of the game, and we make these big sort of proclamations. But it does feel like we made a lot of decisions were mentally made either in the minds of the public or in the minds of the media class around what the future of the game looks like and what it might, and it felt like certain sectors of the press, and I don't think this is necessarily like an indictment of the take, but we're treating this Ashes series as a referendum on the future of the game, and you know, on the one hand you have baseball and a referendum on baseball, but like on the one hand you have the way that England go about it, and on the other hand you have traditionalism and conservatism, and it feels like even with a 4-1 win, conservatism and traditionalism hasn't necessarily won out anyway. Is there a sense of you get out of this of where, you know, we're entering uncharted waters, where we're in a strange new world and Test cricket might not look the same again? And then the other question is, you know, does that matter? Because we're all just, you know, it'll be MI Sydney versus Melbourne Super Giants next year anyway, so it doesn't matter.
I think yeah, it's interesting in the sense that, you know, Australia. If you'd said at the start that Australia would win 4-1, you would have probably thought, and given the way England play, and you look at the two teams, and England, for whether fair or not, England certainly had a much more defined. Not so that Australia didn't have a game plan; they had very good game plans, but I think England, because of baseball, had been so extreme, it was a very defined game style. And if you look from, I suppose, comparing it to, as of course we're prone to do as AFL and us, we sort of go to, you know, Pagan's paddock or Clarko's cluster, or, you know, the Weagle's web, things like that, you know, where they're much more, they have clear names. Whereas if you look at, say, Geelong's great era, it's still going, but, you know, or in the current Brisbane team, there's not necessarily a defined, you know, even a brand. They're just good footy teams. I mean, yes, there are things that Brisbane do. They control possession. Geelong, obviously, very fast moving, attacking, eye catching, but it wasn't like it wasn't cat's ball.
Yeah.
Anyway, so use that as a comparison. Where I think Australia is just, and I know that they've sort of taken the piss with Ron Ball, but that's only as a play on Bazball. I mean, there's no real Ron Ball per se. But the funny thing is, for all that, is because Australia's won 4-1, but they've done so with a better run rate, and they've done so with barely using spin at all, which had already been a bit of a trend in recent years, but taken to the nth degree this summer, where spin was only a factor in one of Australia's matches, really, one of the 5 in Adelaide, which was the closest to a conventional test that we had. Sydney had elements of that, but because there was no frontline spinner, you couldn't really say that it was conventional in that respect. And then the other 3, well, one's pink ball is inherently not conventional, albeit there are conventions within pink ball tests. And then the other 2 have gone for 2 days. So it's just been this bizarre series. And Australia has won on the back of 3 players. I would actually extend it to 4. I would actually extend it to Scott Boland, because I think his role shouldn't be understated. And then you probably use an extension, include Michael Neser there. But really, you look at getting to 3-0 was done on the back of 3 stand-up performances with Mitchell Starc, Alex Carey, and particularly Travis Head in terms of what will linger. And not necessarily, you know, it wasn't convention. It was Travis Head going up to the top of the order and striking at, you know, 90, or Alex Carey keeping up to the stumps. I mean, Mitchell Starc, I suppose, was somewhat conventional in the sense that he has done this, not necessarily to this quite this level of standard, but he's done this for a long period of time. Yeah, I mean, to go back to the broader questions in terms of referendum of Test cricket. Look, there's always culture clash stuff when you come to an Ashes. That's just the nature of the beast, mother country. And I think England is the last bastion of sort of the almost fair game for, I don't want to say racism, because because I think that that's the whole point. It's not perceived to be racist because it's England. But
Mm,
if you can get away with saying bloody Poms that you couldn't get away with saying that about pretty much any other
mm,
nationality
mm,
for obvious reasons, for reasons that are defined by are explained by history and the power dynamic there. But there's always sort of a cultural cringe
mm,
element there. No, sorry, cultural cringe probably the wrong phrase. There's a culture war
mm,
between the two nations. It's pantomime. It's piled on. There's also an element where touring teams here, once it starts to go pear shaped, it goes massively pear shaped, and we saw
mm,
that with the Noosa thing. Um, I think ultimately what it says, I don't think necessarily the game of Test cricket changed dramatically through this series or the series of the referendum. I think ultimately you look back at it, it was just like England just were not very professional and they were not
mm,
very well planned and came in with a game plan that was not. Look, I don't think it was that had no chance of working, but it was like there was a very narrow set of circumstances in which England was going to win this series,
mm,
and we saw it on day one in Perth how that set of circumstances could win. But they needed their frontline quicks to stay on the park.
mm,
They needed quick tests, which is the one they won. They needed guys to go off, um, and in the end, they didn't get nearly enough of that. Um, and Australia were just over the course of it too good. And over the course of a fight, it was not a team that was going to be beaten over 5 tests. It's funny because you argue Australia with so many old players. I suppose the longer it went, it shouldn't have actually worked in their favour. But because some of these tests were quite quick, but B more to the point because England play low percentage cricket. Um, the longer it goes, Australia was always likely, I suppose, in hindsight, and probably even beforehand, always likely to win.
Is there, and you touched on this as well about professionalism, and Ken Ponsonby made this point on the Wisdom podcast, I think, that the, and he mentioned this anecdote, and I've mentioned this a couple of times sort of over the course of this week's pod that, on the day of which we're recording. But Phil Jones on like a high performance podcast, and he talks about like being told ahead of an FA Cup clash that like he wasn't going to play, so go out and have dinner with your wife, and he has 3 beers at at dinner with his wife the night before a game that he thought he wasn't playing. Obviously, in the English sense, that's pints, or in the Victorian sense, that's pints. And so and then unforeseen circumstances, he shows up on match day, and Jose Mourinho says, "Well, you're playing. I'm sorry." And it's disaster. It's panic stations, and he describes it as like one of the worst games he's ever played. And but then we have, and I guess cricket, you can hide it in a way you can't with football, but like we have guys, we have the vice captain of the side, who we now discover was busting up with bouncers in New Zealand, on the eve of the series, and we're pissing up in Noosa, and it's pre-planned, and we have the piss up plan, but we don't have a bowling coach, and so there's this. I guess it feels really incongruous with the state of sort of elite sport in general. Is that why is England like this specifically? Because it's not like England is sort of in this backwards bubble away from all of the sports science that we know. Is that a Brendan McCullum thing? Is that a thing of how does that happen?
I think it's got to be viewed through, and look, I don't profess to be an expert on baseball and the way it came about per se. Certainly not compared to the English press back who cover this, series in, series out. Sort of as Australians, we sort of do drift in and out when we're playing England, and otherwise, it's sort of keep half an eye on it. But I think the sort of prevailing view is that baseball was a reaction to a very specific set of circumstances which occurred in the aftermath of the last Ashes series, where the English team had been playing in and out of COVID bubbles for 18 months or whatever it was. had won one test in last 17, I think was the stat that always goes around. They'd been playing a pretty high intensity game style of cricket, a sort of a more a where that grind them down type of cricket, which wasn't really working either. And there was a sense it was a dour, miserable sort of type of cricket, and that's maybe probably a bit of an extreme view of it, but that was sort of at least the stereotype. And that obviously wasn't working. So McCullum comes in, and with this sort of I think undoubtedly there are some cult-like elements to it, but it frees players up, and this sort of more laissez-faire approach and player empowerment and backing them in, and giving the sense the idea of limitlessness and the ability to achieve great things, and focusing on more what they can do than what they can't do, and all that sort of type of stuff. Clearly, I think there are some benefits of that. So that's how it started, but it's also come, I think, at a juncture where they still had quite a lot of senior players in the team, and I think the likes of Jimmy Anderson, Stuart Broad, even Johnny Bairstow, Moeen Ali, Chris Wokes, who all were still sort of mainstays of the side at that point. They all sort of knew how to, have the cake and eat it too. They could benefit from the best of baseball without it weighing them down. But you look at, or without sort of falling for the trappings of it and the pitfalls. But none of them are still there. And now you get a team where it's Harry Brook and it's Ben Duckett, and it's Bryden Cass, and it's Jacob Bethel, and guys, not all of whom are babies, but they are impressionable and aren't able to. Well, I think the history would now suggest not able to sort of strike the balance between getting the best of baseball and where it was probably fit for purpose at the time. But I think after a while, baseball was only going to get them. And they thought it was going to absolutely revolutionise the game. I think it revolutionised the English game. I think that's not an unfair assessment. And they did have some very good results over the first couple of years. Now, I know they've never beaten Australia or India in a test series, but they did draw a couple of series. And they probably had the better of Australia in that 23 Ashes as some, and again, they just didn't pick the key moments. So there's a lot going for it. But I think the other thing is that sometimes it's, you can think that when you have sort of revolution, you probably even look through its political lens. You can think, oh, this is always the best is always. It's always like also looking at the labor years, post from right start of at the end of '07. Just sort of this now that, and I'm sure those who are closer to the political scene would probably poke holes in this, but
no, I'm looking forward to where this is going now.
Well, you look at say Kevin '07, and you think, well, they're set for sort of a long period of, like the Liberal Party have been in power for a long time, and then Rudd comes in, all this sort of euphoria, this hope, this new generation politics. You think, well, they're set for a long, certainly by Labor standards, a long reign of government here, and yet
it became outdated quite quickly.
Quite quickly, yeah, exactly. And I mean, there are obviously other issues there, and most to do with Rudd, but clearly there were a lot of
Kevin Rudd is Brendan McCullum. I'm liking where this is going.
Yeah,
There's the clip that.
Yeah, there's similarities. I suppose it can be it's later than you think. It can be over before you know it, and often when these things come into play, the best is right at the start. It's really fresh. It catches everyone on the hop. Their sort of master plan also, because they're so Ashes-centric, so they were building up towards this summer. But by that point, it had been in place for 3.5 years, and it was probably a bit outdated. And it had fallen outdated both from a tactical perspective, but also from a managerial, human resources perspective. Like we no longer. These guys, we're no longer getting the best out of these guys because that particular type of leadership was really effective at raising them from here to here, or here to here, but getting here to there possibly requires a different type of leadership.
I want to come back to this idea of will Test cricket look the same for a moment? Mostly because I want to use it as a segue to talk about privatisation and sort of the future and crystal balling. But do we think we come away from this with lessons about how Test cricket can be played differently, or like or are we just doing the same? I guess domestically, are we just doing the same thing sort of over and over again? It was put to me by a friend of mine that Bazball is a response, and a response to many things, but a response to Brendan McCullum's idea of what Australia was like when he had to play against them, and he quite uncharitably was put to me, wasn't smart enough to take all of it in, and so now we have this sort of this crystallized, distilled version of it, which might miss the finer points of why Australia was so successful over the course of the 2000s and 2010s when you had to play against really aggressive Australia sides. But like, is there a world in which we see Test cricket being played differently over 2.5-3 days, and we cut days of Test cricket out, and we build pitches fundamentally differently as a result of some of the lessons out of this?
I think the thing that I was left with from this Ashes series in terms of the future of Test cricket that most concerned me was that, and this is a capitalist view, but what will broadcasters be willing to pay going forward if they feel as though 2 and 3 day tests are going to be relatively commonplace, which over the last 5 years in Australia they have been, and that has to inherently dilute. I mean, look, Test cricket clearly as a product is an absurd proposition because it's on any number of metrics, any number of in terms of the length it goes for.
No one's saying would come up with this concept today.
No, you're not designing Test cricket now. Test cricket has lasted because of the history, and its strength is its history, and Test cricket is viewed through a historical context. Having said that, I still think there are some, like, it's lasted so long because it is also, and I hate using that word product, but it is an amazing product. Like, it is actually, its best is so good and it's so gripping. I mean, there is still a lot of Test cricket that is quite dreary, even now. There are lulls. I think you've got to, if you look at Test cricket as a whole, you've got to, it's almost got to be looked through in different nations. Like in Australia, there's an appetite for Test cricket in this time of year. In this particular window, it's sort of it's a bedrock
entirely in this room.
In this kitchen. Yeah. It's very much, it's part of the cultural fabric of the Australian summer. Part of the rhythm of the Australian summer has been for a long time. Even though it has evolved, and the Boxing Day Test is not necessarily as much as an establishment as we think it may be. It's not centuries old. It as recently as the mid-90s, it didn't even start on Boxing Day, and recently as the late 80s, they played an ODI on that day. And the Sydney Test is similar. It's only been in this current slot consistently since the late 90s. But nonetheless, that's now essentially a good generation where they have been the bedrock of the Australian summer, and everything else sort of works a bit around them. Adelaide has moved various slots. Perth has clearly they've had issues in terms of not finding the right time, and been other factors that haven't worked in their favour. COVID particularly meant that they didn't get England for a long time, and then they got them for 2 days this year. But I think in essence, it's so culturally entrenched within Australia and within England, albeit with England it's less of a. It's not a monoculture. Australia, not that Australia is a monocultural nation, but within Australia, the cricket remains if there is a monoculture, then cricket is a central part of it. Whereas in England, I think that's not the case. I mean, it's not that there's a lot of people who like cricket in England, but there's also, as a percentage of this, and I think the hardcore cricket fans in England are actually harder core than the cricket fans in Australia, but they're not necessarily. They're not as a percentage figure as broad as they are in Australia, but in England you have a much bigger population, so the economics still work. And there's also obviously probably a higher socioeconomic status there, whereas Australia it is more It is more an egalitarian sport here. So anyway, that's the economics of Test. If Australia and England just played in isolation in home summers, not even just against each other, against India or even against South Africa, New Zealand, Pakistan, even Sri Lanka, like you'd probably it could work because people would just rock up because they like the rhythm of Test cricket during that time of the year. It's where it fits within a broader landscape, and I think that the clear example at the moment is South Africa, who have earned status as World Test champions and have only franked that since then by winning in India, not playing any home tests over an 18-month period, maybe longer, 2 years, certainly none this summer, because the economics of Test cricket in that country don't really work, or certainly don't work relative to the strength of the SA20, which obviously is a segue into the Australian discussion too. But so yeah, in terms of the future of Test cricket, I always laugh, and I sort of love to indulge in this every time because people always say, anytime you watch, there's a great Test finish on. How good Test cricket just goes off.
How good is Test cricket? Yeah,
how
exactly
Test
right.
Cricket. I remember, like, it happened during the England-India, the end of the England-India series, start of the year. It didn't happen over the summer because it wasn't very good, but happened over the England-India series in mid-25 in England, particularly the end at the Oval.
Melbourne last year.
Yeah, a lot of the Australia-India series was like that. But even like, it'd occasionally be you'd be some thrilling finish like in October, like people are watching, like word will get around, you got to tune in, going to watch Fox because Pakistan, New Zealand are trying to hang on for a draw against Pakistan, or like I think a couple of years ago, like a February or March match, and Sri Lanka were trying to get like 40 off the last. I can't remember. Sri Lanka and New Zealand were in a ripping finish in a Test match in New Zealand that was like played like 8:30 p.m. local time in New Zealand, but it was still light out because it's New Zealand.
Yeah.
In February, and how good is Test cricket? But to take the piss out of this, I love to sort of when Bangladesh are playing Afghanistan and Bangladesh are 7 for 500, or the West Indies are Zimbabwe. I mean, Zimbabwe played more Test cricket than anyone in 2025. I think it's for some reason their board. I respect to them, but for some reason their board decided we're just going to schedule all these series, and it's it didn't. And they were playing these matches, but they were just being completely outclassed. I think it was on. They were like balled out for like, I don't know. They were following on and like 7 for 46. I just
it's so
how
grim.
good is cricket.
And it comes up at because it's at odd hours, so you like open up like the Cricket Australia app, the Cricket Info app, or whatever, and it's the first. See, it's the only Test cricket being played, so it's the first option. You look at it and you go, yeah,
That's where we're at.
Like, I think that's a good segue. Thank you. Into, I guess other cricket and privatisation and what Australians want, right? Fundamentally, is and there's this other question. I'm conscious Todd Greenberg came out and did Grade Cricketer sort of earlier this week and said some stuff around privatisation and basically didn't rule out anything, which is completely reasonable, a politician's response. But there's the things that he didn't rule out there are things that, like you say, we might have a misconception of them as being sacrosanct, but institutions that are not that old. And so he hasn't ruled out reducing the number of tests in a test summer, hasn't ruled out moving the Melbourne or Sydney test to fit Indian commercial interests. I guess there's a few questions within this, and we can get to them, I'm sure, over the course of this conversation. But I guess it's a foregone conclusion at this point that private equity will, Indian private equity will come into Australian cricket in some form, probably the Thunder and the Renegades. Is it a foregone conclusion that those sides get rebranded and now it's the Melbourne Super Giants play at Marvel? I guess that's the first question, and then B is we can get into do does the Australian public give a shit? Does it make, like, do Indian owners care if Australians give a shit? Like, I really struggle to conceive of a world in which this is even going to be profitable in Australia. Like, I can see how it makes sense overseas. I don't understand how Australians will want to show up to MI Sydney versus Melbourne Super Giants, and I don't understand how that's offset by Indian TV viewership and ads and gambling, even, like, particularly given that Indian players aren't necessarily going to play. So I don't understand any of it, and I guess you have, yeah, this is your beat as far as the boards are concerned. So talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, I guess.
I mean, I think there's a lot of elements to
Sorry,
this.
yeah, there's a lot there.
No, it's fine, because I think you've sort of, the fact that the fact that you've listed several different facets there is important, because it shows that there is so much nuance and complexity to this. It's not a straightforward discussion, and that's why I wouldn't say it's dragging on, because I think it's all happened relatively quickly. But there are having a lot of meetings going on at the moment. State leaders are meeting regularly with CA to work through all this and the finer points of it. But, like, if I'm going to be frank, when it ultimately comes down to cash, and it's not as much as how much it will be appetizing for Australian for the Australian cricket public. It's how much cash is going to come into the game because of this, if this happens, and the preparedness of private investors, be they Indian IPL investors or other high net worth individuals or private equity firms. There's sort of the three major parties that are interested, and the potential influx of cash into the game, which it will pay the players more, and I think that's going to be one of the interesting subplots to this. Is, I think it will there could be there's scope for a nasty pay dispute between players and CA as to who gets what of the pie here. But I think as a broader discussion point, it's just the sheer weight of dollars that will come into the game. I mean, when I think back to the start of the Big Bash League, I was easy to forget that the state-based Big Bash was actually quite successful towards the end.
Oh, I don't forget. I don't forget. I yearn. I pine for the days of John Hastings and the I pine for the return of the CLT20, and I don't forget. There's a 2004 Vic Bushrangers shirt in my cupboard somewhere. I yearn.
Exactly. So, like, back then, I think people were like, when they started, they were just plastic franchise. I know they were at pains not to call them franchise, but plastic club names with these colours that didn't match the state colours and all that sort of stuff. And there was real angst around that at the time. Now, I think particularly in the one-team states, it worked well, and I think everyone in Perth ended up getting behind the Scorchers and the Hurricanes, Strikers, and Heat, and then in New South Wales, Victoria, it's been probably more of a mixed result. But I think over the long run, within a year or two, or a few, I think under Channel 10 in particular, it really became a very powerful product, and they tapped into this formula, and after a while, people sort of forgot that the New South Wales and Victoria playing in domestic T20 cricket was a thing. And people were just worried about, and then because the Sixers and the Heat it was engrossing, people got behind that. I have no doubt that if they look, I think they are very wary about that. I think there's only really a handful of things here with this whole private equity that I think people really, really care about from a public perception. One, probably the two biggest, well, three are which players are playing. Is it going to get the best players playing? Particularly best Australian players, which I think is a net positive, albeit that is potentially at odds with the idea of change that is interrelated to how the Australian summer looks, and if there's significant disruption to the rhythms of the Australian summer, that will cause a lot of angst. And then the third and other particularly emotive one is team names, particularly if they are these, IPL-sized team names. I think, broadly speaking, there's a hesitancy within Australian cricket to go down that path. It is a contrast, say, to what's happened in the 100, where that competition was only 4 or 5 years old, whereas in Australia these are now 15 years old, and there's well, I'm not talking sort of decades, generations of affinity with these teams. There's enough to say we would be relatively careful with what we mess here, and I think there's at least an acceptance that, at least, or hope at least from some of the Indian owners, that the idea is, well, actually, you don't want to change these names because they're strong names as they are, and like you're actually diluting the value. Whether there ends up being some change or not, remains to be seen though. Um, I think if that happened, it would probably only be maybe one or two teams, but I still think that would be disruptive. Which was, a degree depends on the teams. I suppose a team like the Renegades, who have had relatively middling history and are not in a one team town, you're probably more likely to get away with it. Probably a bit more like a Melbourne Heart to Melbourne City type of situation there. Maybe you get away with the Thunder as well, but like you'd be pretty
Is there a
reluctant.
world in which, sorry to cut you off there, is there a world where, because I mean, your colleague Ben Horn broke a story about, considerations around Singapore and Canberra and New Zealand, and, all of those are expansion considerations to various extents. Is that the easy out of just going, right, let's, IPL money, you want to franchise Singapore, Canberra, although, every time Greg Bora wants to put some money in, he'll call up the relevant newspapers and get his piece about Canberra. But like it feels like, is that the easy out of not diluting the product, and if it's experimental and it's out, it's an expansion rather than a buy-in, then you don't risk the core product. Is that something that I guess is being raised? Is that, or are these sort of separate considerations? And I'm conflating, I guess, two sets of business plans.
Oh, I don't think they can't be completely separate considerations, because you're ultimately talking about what the future of the league looks like, and if you and that it would be. I'm sure they're not, but it would be ridiculous for them to be saying, "Oh, well, we'll have that discussion another time." Well, so maybe you could have the discussion another time, but you couldn't be. You can't be having one discussion in one room and one in another. They're connected discussions in terms of what the league looks like. My sense is that expansion is not their. It's not their priority, but not to say it won't happen. Um, I think Canberra's a really interesting one, because Canberra is to cricket a bit what Tassie is to the AFL.
Yes.
It is a tapped market with a limited growth catchment area, a captive audience already, one which loves cricket, and you'd be bringing in a team. Now, Canberra's probably got maybe slightly more upside because of obviously the political importance and the socioeconomic situation in Canberra relative to Tasmania, but you're not. Canberra's not really a big growth market. Like you're maxing out pretty quickly in Canberra. Whereas if you go into New Zealand and potentially incorporate that market, you bring an extra time zone from a television audience. You bring in potential to bring in a lot of extra players from New Zealand. Quite what that does to the New Zealand T20 competition, I'm not sure. And it probably subordinates it to a sort of a feeder competition, which it sort of is anyway at the moment. It's probably, in many respects, it's the last of the T20 leagues, which is like the old state-based Big Bash. It's just an extension of their domestic system. It's not really a franchise competition. And then, Singapore's an interesting one. I mean, the logistics of Singapore is the thing that concerns me. It's like we've seen this across Australian sport when they dabbled with Singapore in the NBL. Super Rugby's had a lot of this where they've tried to tap into different markets, and it's just it's not close. Singapore is not a it's not a short flight to Singapore. Like
No.
particularly over the context of a. I mean, we're having this discussion around um, the Sydney Sixers in the Big Bash finals having to fly across the country back and forth. How does that work if they go to Singapore?
As
Like it's
someone
hard
whose
enough.
partner is about to move to Singapore, I'm acutely aware of the of the of the flight time, but I guess the benefit of it. I mean, the problem is you're right. It's an 8-hour flight. Like worst case scenario, Brisbane to Perth is 5 hours give or take. But you are on a Perth time zone at the very least. So that again, you're not adding a time zone, but you are giving another avenue into the potential doubleheader situation there, which I know is always of paramount broadcast importance. I'm conscious of time, so I guess while we've got you, the last thing I wanted to very abruptly segue into is, and I guess it's not a crazy segue, but I'm conscious that when I sent you these notes for this podcast at the time of recording, Bangladesh was still playing in the World T20. As of this morning, we've woken up to news that it appears they're not going to, and that they have put their foot down. And it appears that it's a government decision rather than a board decision. And the hilariously Melbourne-based president of the Bangladesh Cricket Board, whose son plays fourth grade for some reason, is sort of making quite strong statements about the differences when in this situation compared to when India refused to travel to Pakistan for the Champions Trophy, and how that's being treated and how that's being responded to. Is there? Are they Pakistan? Oh, well, I'm sorry, I've said Pakistan out of habit, but I guess it's implied here. Are Bangladesh and Pakistan disposable here? Like, in the new world order, are we headed towards a world where, like, it fundamentally Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and whoever doesn't get on board for whatever it might be, in this case political reasons, or I imagine there may be a world in which there's competing commercial interests as well. Is there a world where we end up with outposts, isolated outposts of world cricket that aren't connected into this globalized network that is so imperative to tap into that Todd Greenberg talks about?
I think with Pakistan, we're almost already there. I mean, Pakistan sort of do operate in this parallel universe. I mean, the fact that the PSL happens at the same time as the IPL, the cricket calendar almost revolves around the IPL, and everything else gets squeezed around the IPL, and then the PSL happens, effectively overlapping because there's no scope, obviously, for any Pakistanis to play in the IPL, and it's effectively, this will not go down well in Pakistan, but I'm hoping, two people watching in Rawalpindi, like it's in essence a poor man's IPL, just because of the caliber of player and then the amount of money it just is. Not to say there's not some good players playing, but it's not the same caliber of competition. I mean, you'd have to think recent history would suggest yes, they are. You got to play by India's rules, and if you don't, you get flicked. I mean, and I'll say that India. I don't think India is necessarily actively seeking to get. Like, I don't think India wants Bangladesh not to be part of this tournament. But if Bangladesh doesn't want to go to India, they're not going to They're not going to contort. The ICC is not going to contort itself to find a way. Whereas, conversely, and look, I'm mindful that there's nuance to the respective relations between Bangladesh and India vis-a-vis India and Pakistan, security concerns, like how am I sitting in Melbourne meant to know what's real and what's not real in terms of security threats? The ICC saying there's no real credible threats to Bangladeshi security in India. I got no real idea if that's true or not. Obviously, there's been some recent tensions in Bangladeshi-Indian relations, but it's historic. The recent history would suggest, they've had a pretty long, fruitful enough cricket history over several decades where it hasn't been a huge issue. Pakistan's a different matter. But yeah, the flip side clearly is that 12 months ago there's a Champions Trophy in Pakistan, and India win the tournament despite not once entering into the host nation. You know, I mean, it's quite interesting actually. This thing about Pakistan cricket last night. I mean, they've actually got a good situation at the moment coming up to this T20 World Cup because they're the only country that know where all the games are going to be in Sri Lanka. It's a weird situation. They've reached this compromise for. I mean, it's a logistical nightmare for everyone else as well. As an aside, not that it's a primary consideration, but even if you're trying to plan out, media coverage of it, you don't know if you're going to be flying to Colombo or Ahmedabad at today's notice. You're trying to get visas for different nations. Anyway, but yeah, to go back to the Bangladesh point, it's a massive shame. I mean, I suppose they're not a titan of world cricket, but they're sort of also not like they're no longer a minnow. I mean, they're a test playing nation, have been for 25 years, have proven to be more than nuisance value at several World Cups. So, it's highly unfortunate. But there's been a long history of this in cricket World Cups that predates even India. We saw it in Sri Lanka in '96 with Australia and the West Indies not going there. Obviously South Africa before that with during the apartheid years. Then 2003 with England not going to Zimbabwe, New Zealand not going to Kenya. There've been various other pay disputes at various points of World Cups. So, I'm not saying there's always something, but there's often something, and just the latest in another chapter of that. But yeah, it's rules for some.
I guess we'll find out what the rules for others might be over the course of, well, quite frankly, by the time this podcast comes out next Friday. So there'll be plenty of developments, I'm sure. This will age well, which I'm looking forward to. Dan Cherny, thank you very much for joining us on Perceived Pressure.
No worries, Daany. Thank you, mate. Thanks for having me on.